What started off as a normal Sunday morning interview took an unexpected turn very soon. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, with amazing calm, called out CBS host Margaret Brennan live on the air, and the studio went silent when the court verdict came down. "You won't believe what happened," Margaret Brennan said in a professional but firm tone and stance. "Congresswoman Crockett, with all due respect, the numbers show a big rise in voter confidence since the law passed." But there was a short, heavy pause as the words hung in the air. Then, with a nearly imperceptible shift, Jasmine Crockett simply said, "That's not true." The studio was silent. Crockett blinked slowly, took a deep breath, and said, "This is from the Fifth Circuit decision that just came down 3 weeks ago." He didn't even smile or roll his eyes. She handed up a printed piece from her folder and stated, "It directly contradicts what you just said on air." As the tension grew, you could almost hear everyone in the room holding their breath. Crockett's voice was firm and strong as they looked each other in the eye. There was no roaring or dramatic flair, simply a quiet assurance that said a lot. Brennan looked down at her notes in shock. For a moment she hesitated, and everybody who was paying attention could see it. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but she stopped for 3 whole seconds. The quiet was deafening. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a moment of pure honesty, and the people in the audience saw it. People all throughout the country stopped what they were doing to watch. A producer in the control room, a retired teacher in Manhattan, sisters in San Diego, and more. They all wanted to know the same thing. Did she really correct the host on live TV? Yes, she did. What happened next wasn't just a fact check. It was a tutorial in how to calmly and confidently correct false information. But the fact check didn't make the moment hit so strongly. It was the tone. Crockett wasn't aiming to win the part. She wasn't trying to look good for the cameras or act. She was just making the truth clearer. That alone made the adjustment hit harder than any angry outburst could have. Brennan eventually spoke again after attempting to get better. "Well, Congresswoman, if you're talking about a ruling from mid-May, I think the context was different." But Crockett, never skipping a beat, said, "No, it was the same law, same provisions, and the court called it discriminatory. That's what we're dealing with. That's what voters are dealing with." Her voice didn't waver. No doubt. Just the plain truth. You might think that Face the Nation, a flagship show on legacy media, wouldn't have these kinds of moments. People say it is polished, controlled, and easy to guess. But that morning, the segment didn't go as planned. Before they went live, her producer said with confidence, "This will go smoothly. Just stick to the outline." But occasionally the truth doesn't match the rundown, and this event showed that. In Crockett's own district, a few volunteers watched from a community center in Tyler, Texas at the same time. When Crockett held up the paper, one of them, a retired postal worker called Darlene, yelled, "That's why we sent her up there." Those words would not stay in that room. They would resound through every part of the conversation. Brennan tried to take back control by nodding and looking at the prompter, but the change had already happened. The talk had gone on for a long time without her. The director murmured into the headset in the control room, "Hold this shot. Don't cut, and for good cause." The camera stayed locked. There were no visuals or split screens. It was simply 2 ladies facing each other, one asking questions and the other not giving in. Later, when the producers watched the tape, they would comment, "That's the moment, right there," when she held the paper up. But by then, the talk was already bigger than the show. The world might see the fight for the truth, and it wasn't done yet. You could feel the quiet buzz of preparation backstage. Crockett sat quietly in the green room, with her folder of notes in front of her. Siobhan, her assistant, stood close, knowing that the story they had written wasn't going to go as planned. Siobhan whispered quietly, "They're going to push that stat about voter turnout. We've heard it from 2 other places this week." "It's going around again," Crockett said, not looking up. She was ready to fix the script because she knew it. Brennan went over her notes in the studio. The goal was easy. Get Crockett to talk about how the revisions made people in Texas more confident in the voting process. But they didn't expect Crockett to be so ready. She had seen the headlines, the cherry-picked data, and the tales that weren't being told. She was there to speak for the folks who couldn't speak for themselves, and she was going to demonstrate it. The anxiety was thick when the show started. Brennan started the talk in a polite way, but Crockett was weighing every word, waiting for the proper time. Crockett didn't flinch when Brennan said that voter trust had gone up 12% after the reforms. She opened her folder, and everything slowed down. She could have gone along with it, smiled, and changed her mind. But she didn't. She corrected the record on live TV for everyone to see. And why did it hit so hard? Crockett wasn't just talking for herself. She was speaking for all the voters who had been hurt by this law, the ones who couldn't get off work to testify, the ones whose ballots were thrown out for small mistakes, and the ones who lost their IDs in the mail. Crockett was speaking for everyone. This wasn't about the news. It wasn't about getting a picture for social media. It was about staying true to the truth, even when the whole system is trying to hide it. And that truth, which was carried with calm intensity, sliced through the clamor. The talk changed. It was no longer about what was being said. It was about what was being presented. And while Brennan fought to get better, Crockett's next words hit home. The studio crew didn't say anything. Confidence doesn't mean much when thousands of people can't vote in the first place. The light seemed brighter. There was a fresh energy in the room. Crockett wasn't simply talking about politics. She was bringing up a bigger, more important problem. Crockett didn't stop when Brennan tried to change the subject. She started by saying, in Harris County alone, over 17,000 mail-in ballots were rejected in one cycle after the law changed. That number, 10 times higher than in previous elections, was the punch. And for the first time, Brennan hesitated. She had asked for numbers, and now Crockett had given them to her. People couldn't ignore the reality. It wasn't merely a fact. The interview was no longer about arguing. It was about what individuals were actually going through. And that truth would be talked about, shared, and thought about for days to come. The stillness that followed the cameras said volumes. There were no jokes, no short endings, and no talking from the team right away. Just a calm end. Crockett smiled and nodded as Brennan thanked her politely, but the folded paper, which proved the truth, was still between them. It would stay there for a long time after the camera stopped rolling. The corners of the paper were a little curled, which showed how tightly she had held it in her dressing room. Jasmine Crockett, a member of Congress, took off her blazer and looked at herself in the mirror. She wasn't second-guessing anything. No, she was just tired, not from the fight on air, but from having to explain things that should have been evident to everyone all the time. For Crockett, voter confidence wasn't just a statistic on a chart. It was people, discussions, and real lives. She remembered Mrs. Geneva Bird, who lived in Longview. Mrs. Bird, who is 84 years old and legally blind, was not allowed to vote because the state said her signature looked suspicious. She signed her ballot with her niece's help, but it was never tallied. Orlando Reese from Beaumont also spent 2 hours of pay waiting in line to vote early, only to be told that his registration had been canceled. No one could say why. They just gave him a phone number and advised him to try again next time. Crockett didn't just read these stories in the news. She had spoken with, listened to, and committed to represent real individuals. And that's what made her so calm on the air. She didn't have to learn a counterargument. She lived it every week. The CBS producers were still talking about whether to post the whole clip or chop it down when the topic had already left the building. It was spreading like wildfire all over the country. A youth pastor brought a TV into a church hall in Lubbock so that teens could see the interview during Sunday school. He turned up the volume and stated, "This is what truth sounds like." A stylist called Brenna shook her head as the clip played again in a break room at a Fort Worth hair salon. She didn't blink and whispered, "Wow." But not everyone was on board with what she said. A former state senator from Amarillo tweeted that Crockett should remember she's a guest, not a prosecutor. A conservative podcast made fun of her as another angry liberal, even though she hadn't raised her voice once. A famous Dallas journalist wrote a piece called, "Is Jasmine Crockett Too Sharp for Her Own Good?" She had seen that headline before, but not those exact words. The tone was the same. It was a subtle change from calling a black lady smart to calling her rude, always with respect. But Crockett didn't spend time with names. She was already back in her district 2 days after the interview, standing next to a man called Ray Delaney in a parking lot of a strip mall. Ray had a food truck and had just been informed he had to postpone his voter registration drive because someone said it was too political. They talked for 20 minutes in the sun. No cameras, no speeches. Two folks were only trying to figure out why fundamental civic involvement was turning into a fight. Ray said, "You didn't blink," and then he stopped. Crockett laughed and said that wasn't the hard part. She thought about the labor that came after the camera cuts, including the hearings and the hours spent explaining to voters why their ballots didn't count, even though they followed every instruction. She thought about Mrs. Byrd, Orlando Reese, and many other people who weren't in the conversation. Later that night, Crockett sat at her desk with just one lamp on her as she went through testimony for a meeting of the committee that was coming up. Her phone rang with demands for interviews, opinion pieces, and news stories. She didn't say anything. She didn't do that. Instead, she took out a notepad and wrote how it started at the top. Below that, she wrote Geneva Byrd, Orlando Reese, and Ray Delaney. These weren't headlines. They were things she needed to remember. Something started to change behind the scenes at CBS, though. Not on camera, but in the editing rooms and email threads. It wasn't common for Margaret Brennan to leave the set without talking to the producers, but that morning, she strolled past the control room with her eyes down, her coat folded over one arm, and her heels clicking a bit too quickly on the tile. The executive producer, Dana, yelled quietly after her, but Margaret didn't stop. She just lifted her hand to show she understood and went going. No one said anything in the control room for a time. Then Riley, the same producer who had pointed out the voter confidence data earlier, let out a long breath. "She got us," he remarked, not angrily, but with resignation. It wasn't only that Crockett had corrected the host that stood out. It was how Brennan reacted. She didn't say anything. She didn't argue. She stopped for a moment. She looked down at her notes, and for once, she didn't have a response ready. That moment of stillness was the hardest thing. For someone who is used to directing the conversation, silence can be louder than any script. It wasn't embarrassing. It wasn't a loss. It was recognition, not of being wrong in a gotcha moment, but of being unprepared, live, and on record. Brennan had not given enough thought to how well Crockett was prepared, not how smart she was, but how deep she was. Her grasp of the law, the area, and the specific numbers. Brennan wasn't the only one who made that mistake. It was part of the system. TV news sometimes treats guests like they are actors in a debate instead of experts on real life. If the script doesn't go as planned, the only honest thing to do is to be quiet. Brennan knew she wasn't the bad guy in this story, but she also knew she wasn't the good guy this time. She didn't tweet back. She didn't write a column to back up her point of view. She didn't say anything. Maybe out of respect, or maybe because she recognized that trying to explain would make the occasion seem less important. Brennan's remark became the most impactful section of the episode because it informed viewers what they needed to know. Facts had won without shouting. Sometimes being professional means giving in, and the anchor's chair doesn't always tell the truth. It comes from outside the studio, away from the synthetic noise. This was the point when the conversation moved from the news studio, where it was safe, to the real world. The video started to become viral in barbershops, on college campuses, and in political circles. The clip had already gone viral by Monday morning. There was a lot of it. On Facebook timelines of grandparents in Amarillo, sewn into TikToks by 19-year-olds at Prairie View A&M, and talked about on Reddit and political forums that generally dispute over gas prices and sports. The most popular version was the one that wasn't changed. There was no music or zoom-ins. Crockett just quietly held up her paper and said, "That's not right." The memes came right after that. One picture had Crockett's face on the body of a chess grandmaster, and Brennan was looking at a board in the middle of a checkmate. One person froze the moment when Brennan looked down and wrote, "Control+Z doesn't work here." But not everyone liked it. Conservative analysts were quick to call it a left-wing action. A former Texas state representative tweeted, "Just because she printed something doesn't make her right." It was noise, a lot of it, but something had changed under the noise. More than one journalist privately told CBS producers, "That's what it looks like when you don't clean up the truth." The video had made its way to Capitol Hill by Tuesday afternoon. Staffers shared it with captions such, "You all better get ready like Crockett did." It had become a subtle warning to anyone who was going to walk into national media without being ready. Mr. Chris Talley, a civics teacher at a high school in Detroit, stopped class to show the interaction. A student then raised his hand and asked, "What happens when the truth is not only talked about, but also shown?" The clip kept making waves, sparking conversations, inquiries, and debates that went on for a long time after the original broadcast. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, wasn't interested in the viral fame or the intense internet disputes. She was already back at work, going over the rules and getting ready for the next fight. But she had made her point. Sometimes you don't need to yell to get your point across. You just need to show the truth and let it speak for itself. So she didn't scream. She didn't fight. But everyone paid attention. Why? A local radio caller named Mr. Talley had it just right. He stated, "Power doesn't have to be loud." In Austin, a local radio caller said something similar. "I didn't vote for her, but that woman didn't blink." She knew what she was talking about. That's what we need. But the most telling reaction might have come from people who had felt overlooked for a long time. A senior veteran from Odessa wrote this under the CBS clip, "I mailed my vote in 2022, and they said it never got there. Now I understand. I never heard that aspect of the story before. Thanks, Congresswoman." No filtering, no retweets. Just one sentence from someone who has been missing for a very long time, and that's the strength of the truth. It lands where spin can't get to. But it wasn't only about keeping track of views at CBS. People were looking at the several ways to fix the damage. People didn't all agree on what the network should do next. Most of the time, CBS's Tuesday morning meetings were quite boring. There were just updates on ratings, scheduling, and confirming scheduled guests. But this time, no. The room was full of quiet anxiety before Dana, the executive producer, had even finished her coffee. Everyone was reading the headlines, seeing the social media numbers go up, and trying to figure out how enormous this moment had gotten. The video had gone viral quickly. MSNBC and other big networks played it twice during their morning news. Politico published a newsletter that said it was one of the most honest and informative conversations on a big Sunday show in a long time. Fox News even talked about it, although they called it an example of a left-wing ambush. But the true problem wasn't outside. It was going on inside CBS. One of the producers, Riley, said, "I'm just going to say it. We weren't ready for her. We didn't think she was as sharp and ready as she was." One of the senior segment producers shook her head slowly from across the room. She remarked, "We weren't wrong to ask about voter confidence, but we shouldn't have said it was a settled fact." Dana reclined back in her chair. "So what now?" she asked. The inquiry was not rhetorical. They had to make choices, both inside and outside of their group. Some people wanted to make a correction in the following broadcast, but others said that would make the network look weak, like they had lost control of their own story. Finally, a younger staff member, who was plainly scared, stood out. "If we don't admit it, we're saying that we only like facts when they fit our outline." There it was, the true problem. For a long time, CBS was proud of its history, trust, and journalistic honesty. They weren't as glamorous as some of its cable competitors, but this moment showed a crack, not because they allowed the guest speak, but because the guest brought something they hadn't checked out, and it happened live. At the same time, Margaret Brennan wasn't there. She called in from her residence. Her video was off, but her voice was calm and honest. "We should put up a full transcript," she remarked. "Don't change anything. No comments." Dana cautiously agreed. Just what happened? Do you want to write something on it? You might frame the segment or explain where the stat came from. Brennan said, no, let others see. Let them decide. Her voice sounded nearly exhausted, but not defeated. Riley spoke again, this time with a bit more confidence. We've had lawmakers question our framing previously, but they normally go along with it. This wasn't that. This was a recalibration. The phrase hung in the air. The talk outside CBS headquarters was getting louder. It was starting to come up in the monologues of late-night talk show presenters. Some academic blogs had shared the footage, linking it to bigger discussions about who gets to decide what neutral stories are and who gets to control the media. But CBS was worried about something else. What if this becomes the new norm? Someone said. What do you mean? Dana asked. What if this lets guests bring their own facts, their own decisions, and their own receipts on live TV? The room got quiet. Brennan finally said maybe that's not a bad thing. Nobody knew what to say for her. Second, because the truth was that she was right. The field of journalism has altered. People who watched were more informed. Politicians have social media teams that were as good as any journalistic team. It was hard to get trust back once it was lost. By the middle of the week, CBS secretly released the whole transcript with no editorial note, no softening, and every word from start to finish. That night, Dana stayed late in the editing bay with a junior producer to go over the interviews that were coming up. We're not going to get ambushed again, the producer remarked, only half joking. Dana didn't think it was funny. She looked to the screen where Crockett's portion was halted. It showed a frame of her hand holding the court ruling and her voice in the middle of a phrase. Dana stated, she didn't surprise us. She just showed up ready. We weren't. That acknowledgement didn't come from fear. It came from thinking about it. People didn't want to admit it, but the media environment had changed in some way. The audience had seen the power balance shift, not because someone shouted over a host, but because someone brought truth into the room and let it stay there without saying sorry. But Crockett was already going on outside of CBS. She recognized that people were raising deeper questions about what openness actually means because of her work and her community. 3 days after the interview, Crockett was walking along the sidewalk outside a strip of stores in Palestine, Texas, when a young woman came up to her. She had 2 kids with her, one in a pram and one with a juice box. The woman added, "Sorry to stop you," and she was a little out of breath. "I just wanted to say thank you. My grandma cried when she saw your clip. Last year, she tried to vote, but they wouldn't let her. Said her name didn't match." Crockett stopped and stared the woman in the eye. "Did she get help?" she questioned. The woman said, "Eventually." But she was embarrassed. "You didn't talk about it again until your part aired. Someone finally told the truth on TV," they said. They stood there for a moment, with no microphones or reporters. It was simply 2 folks on the street exchanging something that wasn't censored. Crockett didn't care about applause or attention. He cared about making a difference. Crockett understood that the backlash was only a half step behind, even if support was coming in from all around the country. A conservative presenter on a syndicated AM radio show in San Antonio called her the new face of division. A political blog had a title that said she used federal airtime to smear Texas. Someone also found an old tweet from her undergraduate days and tried to use it as proof that she has extreme beliefs. Crockett has seen this happen before. It wasn't personal, it was to be expected. People strive to make the messenger smaller when the truth makes them uncomfortable, but she didn't get smaller. Instead, she put out a brief video she had made on her phone the next morning. No background, no pictures, just her sitting on a bench at the park in Tyler. "I didn't go on that show to fight," she remarked. "I went on to share the truth about what's going on with actual people who don't have a place to speak, who don't have time to check the facts and sound bites. They deserve more. And I'll say it again, voter confidence means nothing if you can't get your vote through the door." In less than 2 days, that video got more than 2 million views. No music, no showy changes, just belief. Members of Congress from both parties in D.C. took notice. A moderate Democrat grabbed her aside in the hallway and said, "Be careful, you're causing trouble." Crockett smiled. Okay. But this wasn't about party lines for her, and it never had been. She had seen her parents work long hours and knew that every vote they cast was important. Her mother once took her to a polling booth in the rain, holding an umbrella in one hand and Crockett's hand in the other. She said, "You always show up, even when they don't want you to." Crockett took that memory with him to law school, to court, and to campaign events. She brought those court decisions to the studio because of that. Why she talked the way she did, not to be loud, but to be heard. What she said on CBS wasn't easy to hear. It wasn't ready for prime time. It was layered, complicated, and supported by proof that made people uncomfortable. And that was the point, because the truth isn't designed to make everyone happy. It should help you understand things. A town hall meeting that Crockett held in Knox Dodges over the weekend was too full. People stood in the back. Some people were sitting on the floor. Some just leaned against the walls and listened. During the Q&A, a man in a worn veteran's cap came up and asked, "What made you say that?" Most of them would have merely smiled and nodded. Crockett didn't wait. She remarked, "Because if I don't challenge lies when I hear them, I'm just letting someone else write the story of my community, and they'll always get it wrong." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then someone clapped. Then more. But Crockett didn't take it in. She went on to the next question. After the event that night, she sat in her car with the motor off and just thought. She didn't feel like she had one. She felt stable. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a place to stop. There will be more times like this in the future, with more interviews and more attempts to turn facts into stories. But Crockett had made it clear what he wanted, to tell the truth, even if it wasn't easy. But she didn't know how far her stand would go. It would affect not only politics, but also people's ordinary lives, where they suddenly felt seen, heard, and ready to speak out too. In the weeks that followed, things started to change, but not in the news or in political debates. Instead, they changed in quiet areas that people generally don't notice. A social studies teacher named Mrs. Rutledge at Jackson High School in Waco printed out the transcript of Crockett's CBS interview and gave it to her 11th classmates. "Tell them what you think was the most honest moment," she said. One youngster wrote down only 4 words. "That's not right." An older couple sat at a public computer in a library in Lafayette, Louisiana, and watched the clip again and over. They drove into town to get aid with re-registering after being taken off the voter rolls. "You can do it online now," the librarian said. "Yes," the man said, "but this time we want to see it go through." A bunch of Gen Z organizers in Phoenix hosted a watch party, but it wasn't just for fun. They were studying. One of them said, "This is how you correct someone without making it personal." Crockett didn't want to be a model, but that's what she was becoming. She hadn't been too loud when she showed her strength. It wasn't about charm. It was planned, thought out, and based on a kind of serenity that most people don't think of when they think of politics today. Others were noticing too. A Republican worker told a journalist off the record, "That moment with Crockett, there is an issue. Not because it was loud or viral, but because it made sense. It's hard to go against reasonable." Brennan even claimed she made a case I couldn't argue with in a rare interaction with a coworker off the air. And she did it with a piece of paper. That paper, the court ruling, was more than just proof. It became a sign of what happens when you gently bring truth into the room and let it stand. It became a sign, something that stated, "We're not guessing. We are here and have done the work." That was important for communities that had spent years shouting into empty spaces. After Sunday services, churches showed the program. In practice, debate teams broke it down. Community centers made flyers regarding voter protections and added quotes from the interview at the bottom. It went farther than Crockett had thought it would. A group of women from rural Mississippi wrote her a letter, and each one signed it. They remarked that what she said gave them the guts to talk to their local electoral board about the confusing ID restrictions. One of them finished her note by saying, "We don't yell, but we're here, just like you." And yet Crockett didn't see any of this as a chance to ride. She remains the same, straightforward, grounded, and focused. She turned down a number of big TV roles, not because she didn't want to be in the spotlight, but because she didn't want to be the story. She told Siobhan, "The work is bigger than the soundbite." People noticed that way of thinking. At a closed-door civic engagement event in Birmingham, an older civil rights lawyer took aside a group of student organizers and said, "You all keep looking for loud voices, but it's the ones like Crockett, quiet fire, legal mind, relentless truth, that changes the tide." She kept walking across her district, going to churches, and holding clinics to help individuals amend their voting registrations. Some people didn't even talk about the interview. They just hugged her and said, "I'm glad you said what needed to be said." No pride, no pitch for the campaign, just recognition. And over time, other lawmakers began to change as well. They began bringing court records to interviews, quoting decisions instead of party lines, and not letting lies go by, even if they were nice. It wasn't about copying Crockett. It was about getting back space for accuracy. She had told folks that being strong doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it's the refusal to be fooled, the calm insistence on keeping grounded in reality, even when it's hard, uncomfortable, or on TV. That's a new kind of strength, one that doesn't ask for attention yet gets it. But as Crockett was changing hearts and minds all throughout the country, there was still one last thing to say, a reminder of what all of this implies and what follows next. Crockett was in the rear row of a town meeting in Jasper, Texas, 2 months after the CBS interview. No press, no light. There were only folding seats and a mic stand that squeaked. Miss Loretta was in the front talking about how half of her neighbors didn't vote in the last election. They weren't lazy, they were just confused. She said they believe they may be arrested if they make a mistake. They're afraid. Crockett didn't say anything. She just listened and took notes on a legal pad with a pen in her hand. Even with all the clamor and attention, what remained mattered most was understanding people, not simply speaking for them. After the meeting, a man in his 70s came up to her. He had a denim jacket that had worn patches on it. His hold was strong, but it was getting old. He said, "That day, you made a lot of people proud. Not because you fought, but because you told the truth, plain and simple." She smiled and added, "That was the easy part." He laughed. It was funny, but it didn't look easy. But the decision was straightforward in a way, not the logistics or the criticism. She had been taught to speak up when something didn't feel right, especially if the lie could affect someone else. Especially if it might make them shut up. That was the part that the news kept missing. It wasn't a performance, it was an act of service. In Washington, the moment had passed, and fresh viral tales and political diversions had taken its place. But it had an effect on places like schools, community centers, and small-town council meetings. The lesson wasn't about who was correct. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about doing the homework, being ready to talk not only about what you know, but also about what you've been through. Not as a notion, but as a duty. It was about the truth. A lot of people had gotten used to letting half-truths go by, assuming that someone else would fix them. Crockett had told people that you don't have to shout to stand your ground. You only need to know what you're talking about and be willing to speak it. That's what people took with them. College students who now printed out laws before protests. Retirees in East Texas who began taking notes at board meetings in their area. Some journalists even discreetly admitted to doing more investigation after that interview aired. It influenced behavior not by making noise, but by being clear. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember. Power isn't always loud. Truth doesn't always come in the form of a headline. And sometimes the most radical thing you can do is be ready to say, "Actually, that's not true," when someone lies on national TV. That's not being cocky. That's being responsible. In the end, we all get platforms in different ways, a job, a vote, a microphone, or a moment. The outcome depends on what we do with them. Crockett didn't become famous because she made a big deal out of it. She became one because she made it hard to ignore the reality that was right in front of us. So the next time someone encourages you to just smile and let it go, remember that silence isn't always neutral. Even if you do it nicely, correcting a lie might have effects that go further than you expect. It only takes planning and the guts to speak up when it matters. If this story made you think or brought back memories of anything you've seen or done, don't stop here. Let others know. Talk about it. And if you haven't already, click the button to subscribe. The truth doesn't spread on its own. People do.